What's happening, folks? Back with another reaction, back with some more Subhumans. And indeed, this is inspired by the watch along I did to the All Gone Live concert DVD from the Subhumans from 2003, which I just did a watch along for on my channel. And they played songs from, at that point, throughout their career, which is to say, songs going back to the very earliest days, including the one we're about to listen to, up until the early 2000s. And in fact, one of the tunes they played in that concert on All Gone Live, which was derived from three successive nights, I think it was April 26th, 27th, and 28th in '03, in shows that were in Chicago, Minneapolis, and Milwaukee. But yeah, one of the songs they played was This Year's War, which wouldn't actually show up on one of their albums until, was it 2007? Maybe it was 2005? But yes, it was on Internal Riot, which was not out at the time that they did that show, or even the time that I saw them a couple years later in '05. And in fact, when I saw them that year at a place that doesn't exist anymore, the Showcase in Corona, I remember Dick saying between a couple songs that, like, we're working on a new album, this one's going to be on there, it's called This Year's War. So, in any case, there was a number of songs as I went through that watch along where it's like, oh man, like, have I reacted to this? Because if not, I really need to do that. And one of the ones I discovered I had not reacted to is Society, a track from, I think, their very first EP, which was later included on the EP LP, which, of all their releases, might still be my very favorite. It was, as you might guess, comprised of 4 EPs they had released up until that point. I'm trying to remember whether EPLP was released after their first proper studio album, which is The Day the Country Died. I think it was, but EPLP itself is comprised of material preceding that, and this comes from the very first one, which was the Demolition War EP, released in '81. So yeah, I also mentioned during the watch-along that I was pretty sure that 3 out of the 4 guys who are part of the group had been there since the earliest days. Now, I actually thought Dick was one of the founding members. He wasn't. He came in a little bit after, I think like 6 months after they started. But 3 of the 4 members, if you count Dick as essentially a founding member, or at least, from the earliest releases they had, have continued right up into the present and were part of the show that I saw in '05. The only difference is, in the very earliest days, Grant was on bass, and eventually, not Phil, oh no, it is Phil, right. So Phil, I forget his surname, he came in '83, and he's been there ever since. So they've had a very solid lineup, but the person we hear on bass in this recording is different from the person heard in the All Gone Live and, the time that I saw them live and so on. In any case, we're going to listen to Society, a track that I think perfectly articulates the, I don't want to say necessarily nihilistic, but certainly dejected and critical view. Indeed, I think a lot of Subhumans tunes take a sort of deeply pessimistic view on society, on humanity, on our past, on our future, but it's fair to say that's not the only mindset that Dick uses in his writing, which is to say Citizen Fish songs, which, again, that's a ska punk band and, been around nearly as long as the Subhumans. A lot of their songs are about, like, emotions between people, also about society and culture, but in a more optimistic vein. So I do think the Subhumans is like the darkest type of writing that Dick has put out over the years, but if you want to hear him taking a slightly more optimistic, or at least mixed or nuanced view towards humans and the things we do, then you might listen to some Citizen Fish songs. In the moment, I don't think I have any of their material, but maybe at some point I can get a CD or 2 and we can go through them. But yes, I did want to note that, because Subhumans, if you only ever heard his writing from Subhumans, you might think, like, man, you are a really dark person. Now, I think Dick would reply that, like, I'm just responding to the society and the history and the culture and the politics that are out there in the world and that comprise human history. He'd say, it's not me being dark, it's the world being dark, which, again, is what this song Society is about. But that's not the only prism through which he sees the world. In any case, like, lyrically, the song, it speaks to unemployment, people losing their job, and, no one caring about it. There not really being systems in place that are conducive to economic or psycho-emotional welfare. It talks about people being perhaps overprescribed by a pharmaceutical industry, or indeed like being addicted to prescription drugs. It talks about the sort of state of decay of culture, such that like law enforcement is largely used to, arrest people and, bully social movements that don't fit in with the national ideology, such that it drives culture underground, and that's the only place that it can really exist and thrive in a creative manner. So, as I said, I think it's very indicative of a lot of Subhumans writing. Let's give it a listen. It's a pretty short tune. I did mention during my watch-along of All Gone Live that one of my favorite parts is this tune, which has sort of a fun bass line, and that's used as a sort of melody for the vocals. There's a moment, I think it's the second verse, where the band does this little melodic vocalization of the bass line that is serving as sort of the melody motif of the track. And, it's a bit more fun than a lot of Subhumans tunes, which have this dark, wicked, anarcho, gutter punk type of sound. This song still has that sound, especially at the end when it just, really goes off the rails. But overall, I'd say it's on the lighter side sonically of their catalog. So let's give it a listen. This is Subhumans, heard here on the EP LP, but originally from the, I think, Demolition War EP? Yeah, the Demolition War EP from 1981, and the track is called Society.
Our society was dry. Another straight down the law. Fine. You can't get sick, you lost your pills. That's how it can make you ill. Our society, wanna try. Our society, wanna try. Drive around the special car. Sometimes you wonder who you are. You look depressed, you walk upstairs. You lost your job and no one cares. Our society, wanna try. Our society, wanna try. See the basement running round, driving culture underground. They get paid to put you away. The justice system works these days. Our society, wanna try. Our society, wanna try. Join the people on a zone. They lost interest years ago. What hope is there for you and me? If this is our society. Our society, wanna try. Our society, wanna fucking try. Wanna try. Wanna fucking try. Wanna try. Wanna fucking try.
Goes right into the next track, which I think is it Third World War? Yeah, who's gonna fight in the Third World War, which I don't think I've reacted to either, so I'll have to come back and do that one soon. And yes, again, it's wicked, it's scathing, it's fast, it's very much their sound, but as I said, it's like slightly lighter than some of the other tracks just in terms of the melody, and I actually think that do-do-do-do-do-do-do is their vocalization, not only of the bass line and the melody of the track, but I think it's meant to represent like a siren, because that's the verse where they're talking about law enforcement being used to suppress independent movements or, culture that doesn't fit into the national ideology and slogan. And so I think that's essentially them doing a siren. And it was in the third verse, not the second verse. I was mistaken. But as I said, it's amazing to me the consistency, not only of the lineup of Subhumans, but the messages they've conveyed, the relevance of those messages, the commitment to being more than just, words on a page, or more than just peroxide in their hair. They talk about that in a couple different songs, especially peroxide, that, there's some punks who, pay lip service to wanting to be different and not follow just, what previous generations did, but the way they do that is a bit shallow and plastic. And I think, there's different levels you might issue that critique. Indeed, I think there is something to be said for enjoying yourself and, trying to forge good times with friends and playing music where everything isn't always so dire. But I do understand that words don't always change much more than a handful of minds, and if you really want to change things, you have to go out and you have to take part in protest. You have to try to set up alternative communities and institutions that can offer something which these status quo institutions and, you know, millennia and centuries of oppressive political forces don't offer. So I do very much get the idea that, you know, some punk bands, you know, they want to be on an album cover with dyed and spiky hair, but behind that, there's not much more in terms of their actual punk ethos and DIY type of attitude, whereas the Subhumans are on the other end of that spectrum. They've been living their messages going now for more than 40 years. So shout out to Dick and the rest of the guys. Shout out to anyone who watched the documentary, or not documentary, the live concert DVD. I know Michaela did. Someone else commented a couple times, and they were asking me if I've ever seen Culture Shock. I have not seen Culture Shock in concert, but I am a fan of their work. I know I've reacted to at least one or two of their tunes. 6 Foot Rooms for sure, and I remember that was one of my longest intros. I talked about the lyrics for like 10 minutes at the beginning of the video, so if you go back to look at that, just beware, it's a long intro. In any case, I hope folks are interested in more Subhumans reactions. Again, it's a band that I think is an acquired taste. I think there's a lot of people who might hear them and it's like, God, like his voice is intense, and they just kind of have this da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da type of sound, but there's a lot going on there, and I think their music does have great musicianship. I think Phil is a Bruce. I keep getting the two confused, but I think Bruce is a great guitarist, and he has a very distinct style. You know, it's edgy, it's, you know, has this like sharpness to it in a lot of his riffs, but I think they fit the sonic atmosphere of what the Subhumans are doing very well. So again, I think they may be an acquired taste, but once you kind of get what they are and what they do and how they sound, I think they're as compelling as any other old school punk band. So shout out to them, shout out to you, let me know what you think, and I will see you next time. Peace.